So today I wanted to cover utilitarianism and why it's likely the best ethical system. And you'd have to modify it somewhat because the traditional version of it is not great. Um, but I think it had the right idea. And just to give you a primer on the other ethical systems that people use. Really, the most common one is fairly arbitrary. People kind of just go with what their feelings are telling them, and then give rationalizations for why that must be right. Um, it's really not very well thought out. I don't know the percentage of people who are like this, but if I had to guess, it'd be like maybe 80 to 90% of people that I encounter, maybe even more. Um, but it is the vast majority of people that really just have some kind of self-serving uh, justifications for their thinking that is so full of contradictions. It's laughable. Um, so there's other ethical systems that you have that run into problems. Divine command theory, I am not really going to cover because I don't think there's a basis for believing in God in the first place, or a good one. Uh, then you have Nicomachean ethics, which is kind of like taking two extremes and trying to find the middle ground. Um, the problem with that is you can't really systematize that. So again, it's somewhat arbitrary. Um, and then you have uh, Kant with the categorical imperative where he's saying like if you can't universalize your rules, then it must be unethical. So like if if everybody lied, that wouldn't work because then lying would not work. Like lying only works if some people lie and then other people don't lie. Um, I think that somewhat is getting close there. The problem with that, or deontology in general, it seems, is that you still have to look at the consequences. People can't just be a um, not the ends but the means, as Kant says. You still have to care in terms of a hierarchy. Like, well, is lying worse than killing, say? So if you had to lie but you didn't end up killing someone, did you make a moral decision or didn't you? Because according to Kant, then you wouldn't have, because you lied, even if you saved a life. So it's complicated, and deontology doesn't tend to get at the hierarchy of moral decisions. So it might be able to say that this or that isn't moral, but they're all on an equal playing field. And I think that's missing some details there. So anyway, now we get into utilitarianism. Now, the problem with utilitarianism, as it currently is understood, is it's too simplistic. It has the right idea, but it doesn't actually get you much of what you would need. Um, so a lot of criticisms of utilitarianism is that they view it as kind of hedonism. and a very simple hedonism. So you're always going to go for something that gives you the most pleasure and the least pain. So they say that as a result, under utilitarianism, you could just be like a drug addict, essentially, um, or a heroin addict or something, because then you'll get the most pleasure, the least pain, and that'll be it. Um, Now, this to me is a misunderstanding of what is actually in your best interest, because when you have a more sophisticated view of what is in your best interest, there's different types of pleasures and pains. So if you're just going with like that singular type of like, I don't even know how you would categorize it really, but um, like a single hit of dopamine, say, from the drug, that is different than the type of pleasure that you get from like accomplishing something, or like, like doing a goal that you wanted to do for a long time, or feeling satisfied. That's another type of pleasure. So like there's a lot of different kinds of pleasure. There's the pleasure of contentedness. Um, there's, yes, the simple, perhaps more carnal pleasure of like just experiencing like good food or something. Um, so a lot of people who criticize utilitarianism tend to only go with the carnal pleasures, and they think that it's maximizing the carnal pleasures, and that, it seems to me, is too simplistic, because there's really a ton of different kinds of pleasures that should be looked at if you care about the consequences of everything. So, what does this look like in terms of a picture? That's a very complicated picture, because if you're trying to maximize all types of pleasure, you would also have to see them on a hierarchy. So, for instance, um, just to give you an example, basically, what the goal of utilitarianism, as I see it, I guess I would call my ethical view a modified version of it, is to try to essentially create as close to heaven as you could, on Earth. That's essentially what you're trying to do. So all that that entails would be like, how do you maximize the most rich version of happiness and minimize the worst version of pain and all that that entails. Um, so, like, if you're defining happiness, a lot of things you would have to take into account. Like, for instance, just having good food is a temporary kind of happiness. That is a very short-lived thing. That's obviously necessary, but you need a lot of other types of happiness to have an overall contentedness. Like you can't feel happy or satisfied with life just from eating good food. So that is one part of the picture. So the idea here would be to try and create a picture where all of these things are relevant. So if you're making an ethical decision or a moral decision, it would be trying to take into account all of these things. Um, Now, the problem with this, uh, really the main problem, is that it's extremely difficult to do, and in my view, currently impossible to do. You cannot give an accurate value judgment um, on like how much something brings you happiness or how much something brings you pain um, without being somewhat arbitrary. So, like, even if you go through a 1 through 10 scale, like, what type of happiness is it? What type of pain is it? We do not have that fine-tuned of um, like an internal way of looking at things to the point of it being like a down to a science. It's more based off of feelings, and these feelings can kind of not take into account the ambient uh, environment. So, like, for instance, if we'll just keep it simple, if you eat a piece of food that is somewhat gross, you might feel that it's even more gross than you would have in different circumstances because just this morning you I don't know, found out your dog died, say. So the point being is like your surrounding environment can kind of change your perceptions of how much something is good or bad. Um, and it's not context independent. It is context dependent to some degree. So it's very difficult to get an accurate reading without being somewhat arbitrary. So with utilitarianism, you're essentially trying to do a moral calculus where it's like a big math problem. You're trying to figure out, okay, feeling of contentedness could be like +5. Uh, Feeling of eating good food could be +1. Feeling like your dog died could be -10. So like you're trying to get to the biggest positive number, essentially. Um, and that's very difficult to do. But I think when people are considering ethical questions, all of that would be relevant if you care about happiness, which it seems to me is what you should be caring about when you're making an ethical claim in the first place. So like um, so to take an example, let's say you punch somebody in the face because they made fun of you. Is that a right or wrong action? Well, that depends. Um, it depends on a lot of things, so much so that it would be difficult for me to even summarize it in a video. How is that person going to react? Is it going to adjust their behavior so they don't make fun of you before? How much damage did they do in making fun of you? What are the knockoff effects of that? How much damage did you do in punching them in the face? See, some people you can punch in the face and they would kind of learn their lesson and it'd be like kind of an adversarial friendship. And, that they'd shrug it off and they'd be like, okay, I deserve that or whatever. And then other people that would escalate the violence. Um, and if you escalate the violence, then that would be something that would change the equation even more. So the point being is this gets extremely complicated, and the problem with other ethical systems is to just say that it's always wrong to punch someone in the face is by definition ignoring these complications, because sometimes punching someone in the face is helpful. It will change their behavior enough that they will not make fun of someone and they won't make fun of other people because they're not wanting to get punched in the face again. And yes, it's a negative for them, but it would be a positive for the group. Um, so you get into group ethics versus uh, individual ethics here. And the basic idea is that the group generally would take precedence, because it's more people. So like if you're just going to favor one person versus if you're going to favor like 20 people, it would generally, the math would work out to favoring 20 people as opposed to one person. Now there are exceptions to this, that being like if you have 20 people who are well fed and one person who is starving and you only have one apple, the person who eats the apple who's starving is going to get a lot more out of that than the people who are well fed, right? So again, this is a very complicated thing, and the reason I don't think we're there yet is because it's so complicated that you can't really uh, make a calculation on the spot because a lot of it is arbitrary, at least as it currently stands, or at least somewhat arbitrary because we can't predict the future. We don't know how punching that person in the face is going to change their behavior. We don't know if it's going to change their behavior. We don't know the outcome of that. We don't know the outcome of when we make fun of someone. We don't know if that's going to cause them to have a very negative internal monologue. We don't know if that's going to cause them to um, want to toughen up. We like there is a lot of variance that can happen in any one of these situations, and because we don't know, it doesn't make sense to me to just say, as a rule, this or that is just wrong to do, um, which is typically how people operate. And if they don't operate like that, again, it's arbitrary without acknowledging that there is more complication here than they're willing to look at. Um, so currently, uh, and there's a lot more to say there, but the general picture is that this is an extremely complicated thing. So currently the actual ethics that I think was within our grasp is that you have to guess. You have to guess, which I suppose is what people are doing without knowing it. I would say the average person kind of has a fairly surly attitude about what is right or wrong, and they're fairly sure about it. And I think the correct attitude would be more accurate to say that you're making a guess, um, because you can't really figure it out in any systematic way, at least currently, because we can't predict the future and we don't know the effects of all of our actions completely. Um, so anyway, I just wanted to give a summary of my viewpoint. And yeah, it seems like every other ethical system that I encountered is really lacking. Um, and a modified version of utilitarianism seems to be the most all-encompassing, but it's also currently impossible to do because we're just too short-sighted um, at this time. We just can't figure out a lot of the relevant things. So as a result, we're left with kind of a mess in terms of ethics. So whenever you see like people being rock solid certain of this or that, like really? Like how are you that certain? How are you getting that? Because there's so much complication here. The only way you can be certain is if you willingly ignore like a ton of that.